It's time to stand up. Welcome back to the second session of the semi-finals of the AMEU Presidential Debate Competition 2018. So our speakers for this session are Chit, Framjee, Tai Jie, and Yit Wey, and they'll be speaking in that order. The motion for the second session: the Malaysian government should establish state-owned renewable energy companies to grow the industries. So a few information pointers. In Malaysia, GLCs, which are government-linked companies, are a common practice and source of revenue. Some examples of GLCs in the energy sector are Petronas and Tenaga Nasional Berhad. So in European countries, the renewable energy sector is seeing tremendous growth, partly because of subsidies and government funding provided by the government. Right? And however, in Malaysia, the renewable energy sector is still considered in its infant stages. So with that information, you may begin the debate. Our first speaker, Chit, you have the floor.
Right, the motion of the day today is Malaysia government should be actually establish state-owned renewable energy companies to actually grow the industry. Take note that the key takeaway today is, in the end of the day, what our aim is to grow the entire industry in terms of energy, renewable energy. So with that goal, we have to look at the problems and the status quo right now nowadays. Okay, recently, our Ministry of Green Technology and also Energy, Green Technology and Water actually cancelled 4 IPPs project, which is independent power producer. Mainly because this 4 is not actually beneficial towards the government, and they're reselling the power towards the national grid at a much higher rate. Now this actually increases the cost of electricity, and it does not beneficial the whole industry as a whole. So what are we looking today? Now there's a few things that we need to enlighten everyone. First of all, is our power grid is actually monitored and regulated by our national policy. It's not someone who has wants to build a power plant can just came in and sell their electricity towards the national grid. And secondly, those IPPs or even driven are mostly being subsidized or being provided tax reductions in terms of government incentive. So what's being offered here today is Malaysia is actually giving out or selling, making profit for them at a much higher cost, which is actually in terms it's bringing harm towards our national energy policy. So what are we trying to propose today? Now, what are the benefits of having a state-owned and renewable energy? Now, there's a lack of incentive and also initiation for private companies to actually incentivize or actually start R&D development in terms of having renewable energy, unless they are actually being subsidized or being provided a huge lucrative from the government itself. Now, without the play, we need a bigger player in terms of government or state-owned participations, so that in a huge way, we're able to participate and also restructure the whole national grid policy. So actually, even though we want the private industry to actually have the initiative to start up companies in terms of renewable energy, but it's very difficult for them, and they are not being driven in terms of social impact. So in the end of the day, what the government need to do is we need to start a knee-jerk effect. So by having a state-owned, one of the benefit of it is, first, we're able to kickstart the industry by providing more R&D research, and also we're able to normalize the growth or the power grid, power regeneration percentage towards the nation as a whole. Now, take note that a few things are state-owned, for example, nationals, it's regarding national securities, for example, airports, customs, or even, for example, TNB or even Petronas. Those are state-owned companies where we're actually profiting out of it. So in the long run, we want renewable energy, state-owned energy to be profitable, and in the end, it's sustainable towards the whole economic industry. And in terms that we're going to grow the industry out of it. Okay, so after saying that, now let us look at the outlook of it. Is it actually feasible for us to have state-owned energy company. Now, on average cost of actually installing solar panels have decreased more than 70% over the course of 7 years, from 2010 to 2017. And also, we see an increase in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of hydropower power plants in Malaysia. So our industry and so the government policies, we need to increase the percentage of renewable energy in the nation. Where they want to bring out, if not mistaken, want to bring out hydropower energy to almost, I think, 20%, if not mistaken. Can do the fact on that, right? And anyways, so going on. So what I'm trying to prove is Malaysia is trying to go going deeper in terms of renewable energy, but it's so diverse. There's so many things that we can take it on. It's not only about solar panels. It's not only about hydropower electricity. There's a lot of things. For example, biothermals, biogas emission, etc. So a lot of things are not being incentivized, and therefore no one is taking the stakes in terms of developing industry out of it. For example, we see a few things of it. Even though Proton is actually a failure in terms of state-owned enterprise, but in the long run, it actually pumps up a whole end of industry. For example, we're actually producing spare parts internal in Malaysia itself, with assembly plants, where we can actually have a few assembly plants where we can transfer technology, etc. So what we're trying to do right now is not only look at is it feasible that can we only grow the industry by our own, but we need to take an incentive, because all we know that right now the incentive and also tax are giving are failing. How do you say it's failing? Because they're only profit driven, and at the end of the day, we're paying a higher cost. So if it's an state-owned company, it will be more in terms of the interest of the people in Malaysia itself, and we're actually moving in terms of cost that is not being profit driven. So there will be a few debatable things. For example, that we already have independent producer. We can provide more incentive. We don't need to bring out a huge amount of capital to throw into. And most probably, state-owned companies will dominate the industry, etc. Now, bear in mind that the state-owned company actually dominates one particular industry is because the lack of player and the lack of influencer in terms of the benefit of people. For example, public transportation. The people need it, however, it should not be profit-driven. This is the same case in terms of energy itself. Even though renewable energy is being seen as a game changer and everything, we want to bring up the cost down to us in the end. However, in terms of energy, if we were to bring out a large portion of Malaysia power generation is from renewable energy, now it's going to affect our manufacturing plants and our manufacturing industry. We're trying to grow them, we're trying to grow the industry. We need a cheaper way to actually produce power in terms of make our nation actually being competitive. Being said so the worst case scenario is we have a state-owned company which is actually putting a lot of R&D in terms of industry. Even though if we sell, in the worst case scenario, if it fails, it actually prompts up and actually provide more smaller enterprises to take up the responsibility, because we have to show pave the way to them in terms of policy making and etc. With that, I would like to rest my case. Thank you.
So that the floor is open for points of information. Are there any points of information for Mr. Chen? TJ followed by Framjee.
So you considered that government-owned companies such as Proton and Mars are huge financial failures and often require huge bailouts by the Malaysian government. In light of that, why do you still support the Malaysian government owning a corporation?
Thank you, Sir. Framjee.
Now, Honorable Sir, you stated that it's for the betterment of the country. We need to make the country more competitive. So now, understanding that Malaysia has a rural electrification scheme in the future, where it plans to increase the electricity availability to rural households, do you believe that by the government partaking in these state-owned enterprises, we can actually lower the cost of things like solar paneling for these rural communities and therefore increase electricity coverage?
All right, thank you for the question. Now, on the first question, there's a lot of bailouts and also failure in terms of financial by the two companies. For example, the iconic one are Mars and also Proton. But bear in mind that not all state-owned companies are having such a bailout and etc. What we're trying to do is, even though we need a bailout, for example, actually Mars actually prompt Asia to actually come over and take over the industry. It's a more competitive way. And even Proton, we have Producer outperforming them. It's also another national policy car. So if today there's no Proton and MAS being the first initiations to actually kickstart the whole industry, we wouldn't have this kind of competitors coming out and also outweigh them. So in the long run, it will actually benefit the whole industry. It's not only about is it sustainable, is the company making profit or etc. Because in the end of the day, it's the interest of the people itself. On the second note of it, which is actually on the power grid, we want to increase capacities and also ability and coverage. Now, what we're trying to do now, renewable energy, we're trying to do is we're actually contributing towards the social cost. We're trying to bring down our carbon footprint. But what you're trying to solve, you want me to solve another problem, which is we want to increase coverage towards rural area. Those are being done in a much smaller scale because they need an off-grid power supply with it. They need a smaller grid because it doesn't really, it's not feasible to bring a long lines of power grid in terms of increased efficiency. So those are being managed by small and independent power supplies companies. However, what we are talking about is a bigger picture here. It's about Malaysia power generation in the whole, in the sense. We want to increase the renewable energy contributing towards power regeneration. So this is what we're trying to do. So it's an entirely different context. However, I think that it might, in the long run, it will be much more, if we can bring down the cost of actually installing a solar panel, it will much more beneficial towards the rural area as well.
Thank you very much. So we have a little more than a minute left. Are there any other POIs or follow-ups? DJ first. If there's more time, we'll take again.
To follow up the previous question, the question I asked was that why the states have to come in? Because enterprising people who know the industry and who can see opportunity will come in and invest in industry regardless. We do not need the state to come in and fail in an industry, pump taxpayer money into this industry, to then let private entrepreneurs come in afterwards.
All right, thank you for the question. Now, the logic is simple. Because in the initial stage, no one wants to start us public transportation. That's why we need rapid KL, we need rapid Penang and everything, because those are actually stakes-owned enterprise coming in to play. In the initial start, there's no airline being started by the industry by Malaysia itself, because there's lack of incentive and no one actually paved the way. Because in terms of, if we're actually doing it, it's state-owned, we actually can alter the policy in terms of making it profitable and also making it more competitive towards the industry in the whole. In the sense that if we want to, in the sense that because that most of the renewable energy company right now works in a smaller scale and they're profit driven, they're waiting for our government incentives and subsidiaries to actually help out and fund them in terms of R&D research. If we can actually do it on our own and stop being profit driven, we can do much more. And in terms of for the government, for the national power grid policy, it looks much more lucrative if we were able to make it in a larger scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Chit. As we go ahead. So with that, we're moving on to our second speaker for session 2, Framjee. Yeah, that's all.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me really identify what the crux of today's debate is. What does it really boil down to? So when we say that the Malaysian government should provide state-owned electricity companies, renewable energy companies, what we're really trying to prove here is, as the third speaker brought out in his very relevant POIs, why the government and why not just leave it to the private sector? Why does the government have to step in when we can just allow the private sector, which we all know has more information and more qualified individuals than the government, to run itself? Obviously, why not let the private sector handle it rather than the public sector? So that is my goal here today. My job is to prove to you as to exactly why we need the public sector in Malaysia. But before we get into it, let me first just highlight on the points that were brought out by the first speaker. Overall, his speech centered around the fact that we need to make Malaysia competitive. And I'm going to prove to you in my speeches as to exactly why we need renewable energy for Malaysia to not just be competitive, but remain competitive in the long run. So along those lines, I have come up with three major arguments. Firstly, that it fits into the government's goal to pursue this policy. Secondly, that the private sector has incentives to act against the common good. And thirdly, that it is the role of the government in the first place. So let me dive into my first point. First, it is the government's goal. Now, the Malaysian government has actually announced their policy of ensuring 50% of energy suppliers will come from renewable energy by 2050. This is a very ambitious goal for a country that's currently heavily dependent upon oil and other forms of non-renewable energy compliance. So what we understand is that the current national capacity is 13 gigawatts, right? And if we want to maintain this capacity in the future, we need to understand that non-renewable forms of energy are not going to be there forever. Our younger generations are going to come into this country. And what happens if we're still stuck on it? Let me bring up the very example of Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste is a government that refuses to accept the fact that its oil supply is running extremely low, and it continues to supply energy to its country on that basis. But we can easily see that Timor-Leste is going to end up as a failed state. That's what UNESCO, World Bank, and several other organizations claim will happen to Timor-Leste if it continues to be dependent on non-renewable resources. So if Malaysia is to remain competitive in the future, we need to explore alternative forms of energy. Secondly, the Malaysian government has also announced a rural electrification scheme, that is deliverance of electricity to the inland areas of Malaysia, the rural sections where there's not currently a very good supply. So what we understand is the best possible way to achieve this is by solar paneling, because currently it's very difficult for some of these regions to gain the same mainline access to electricity that we enjoy in the urban areas. So how are we going to give this solar paneling to these rural areas? If I were to relate to you a simple personal story, I myself am a Monash student, and one day I went to check my bank account and realized that I was 6,000 ringgit richer. I thought to myself, yes, I'm sorted for the semester. But to see, my father accidentally deposited the money he wanted to put into his solar paneling into my account. And I get money, but that's a different story. What that story drives in is the simple fact that it's so expensive. And me, being a middle-class consumer, being just able to afford that, well, I get the money, but being just able to afford that shows that these rural households are not going to be able to afford that if you give them an individual scheme of buying from a private company, like the third speaker is probably going to bring up in his speech. So this is why the government needs to step in. They need to step in. They need to subsidize these private companies, and they need to at least take over to a great extent and provide to these people, because we need to increase the supply. And let me dive back into simple economics here. When you increase the supply, the costs go down and it becomes more affordable. So this rural electrification scheme that the government is proposing, the best possible way to do it is by pursuing this policy. And secondly, yes, it is expensive. It will result in around 60,000 to 100,000 ringgit on the government's part just to supply this kind of projects to several villages. So, but what we understand is that the Sustainable Energy Development Authority of Malaysia has a feed-in tariff scheme that will cover this cost over time with taxes with around 7 to 10 years. And it's a necessary burden that I'll prove later on. Now, diving into my second point, why the private sector shouldn't handle this. Let's examine energy production. Energy production is, in economic sense, excludable, and it is not rivalrous. So that doesn't make it a public or a private good. We call that bad boy a natural monopoly. Basically, in that sense, you can exclude, you can produce it and provide it to several consumers. They can use it, other consumers won't be affected. But you can select who you're supplying it to. And when you give that to the private sector, whose profit-driven, whose profit-maximizing motives will sort of warp and turn that into a nefarious new motive that is increasing prices. Why should they have any incentive to continually increase supply for the betterment of society? Then they can jack it up and create they are the only competitor in the industry. Let's say if the government doesn't pursue schemes to produce several of these companies. They can easily turn it into a natural monopoly which increases prices and reduces the availability, especially, as I previously mentioned, if we're trying to achieve rural electrification, this is disadvantageous as a whole. So there's a serious issue there. Secondly, now the third speaker brought up in his question, there have been disastrous attempts with Perodua and Proton. My good sir, don't think of Proton and Perodua. Think of Kia and Hyundai. Kia and Hyundai were South Korean companies that were at the infant stages. The government protected them, gave them subsidies, really nurtured them, and built them to the point where they're now outclassing Toyota and Nissan. So what we understand is that the current private renewable energy providers in Malaysia are at their infant stages. They can't produce on a national scale, and they certainly can't provide to several people without asking for exorbitant amounts. Currently, only the upper and middle income earners would be able to afford such a scheme. So by the government stepping in, it'll actually be able to nurture these companies, and if they take over production, they take over most of the management of the company, they'll be able to encourage them to grow and inculcate a larger field of supply to the Malaysian nationals. And finally, let me go to my last argument, which is the role of the government. Now, the role of the government is to ensure, one of them is to ensure economic growth. So how are you going to ensure sustained long-term economic growth if your country is dependent upon a supply of energy that will run out in the future? How are you going to ensure that we remain competitive if it's going to run out in the future? Secondly, they also have an ability to protect the environment, and by doing so, we have to pursue policies such as solar power, turbine power, and wind power, all wave power, that have all been acknowledged by the SEDA as viable sources of energy for Malaysia. So that is something that the government must pursue. So, honorable ladies and gentlemen, just to recap, I've provided to you proof that it is the government's already existing notion to achieve such an objective. Secondly, that the private sector taking over it would be worse than hell come to earth. And thirdly, the simple fact that it is the role of the government to continue to provide this. So with that being said, I receive the floor.
Thank you. With that, the floor is open for POIs. Are there any POIs for Framjee? Yit Wey, followed by teachers.
So my question is that you asked us to compare with Hyundai instead of Proton. But my question is, what is actually the difference? Proton is also an infant industry 30 years ago. Do you actually think that Malaysian culture of actually helping it affects it? And it's also like our ex-Prime Minister, Dato' Sri Najib Razak, has mentioned earlier this year that they say that Proton is actually too big to fail. Does that actually occur to this renewable energy company as well? And what are your suggestions to it? Thank you.
Thank you. Teacher?
My question is, with regards to renewable energy and the government creating a new company, why should the focus of this be in rural areas? Recognizing the fact that renewable energy is more expensive now and it may be cheaper to extend current power grids that are based on oil-like industries, oil and gas, why do we have to focus on the rural industries instead of extending the current grids which may be cheaper?
Thank you, teacher.
Yes.
So yes, the fourth speaker brought out a very valid point. Proton was heavily incentivized and subsidized by the government, and it grew complacent. So that is why when we are catering to these private companies, the government needs to take into account the fact that they need to also show a certain degree, or when the government takes it over, they need to show a certain degree of competitiveness in the industry. They can't go too far as to become too big to fail. They need to sort of introduce a new system of checks and balances to ensure that the same problems don't happen. 2 times of the mistake, I believe that the government is now better equipped to handle that kind of a flaw. And secondly, the third speaker brought out that why should we focus on these rural areas? Why not just focus on the urban areas? The simple fact of the matter is, if you want to build a more cohesive and competitive country in Malaysia, you can't continue to ignore the rural areas. My home country of Sri Lanka is completely focused on its urban areas, whereas the rural areas continue to fall into disrepair. And that's not going to allow you to uphold and bring up the country's economic performance if you continue to ignore them. And that's why the government of Malaysia has acknowledged the rural electrification scheme. You need these kind of notions and motions in order to build the country as a whole.
Thank you, Framjee. We still have a little under 2 minutes left. Are there any other POIs? Okay, seeing as there are none. Thank you, Framjee. And we'll be moving on to our third speaker of today's session. TJ, you have the floor.
Renewable energy is a promising sector and one that is good for Malaysia. However, just because it is good often means that it creates a front for the Malaysian government to hide cronyism and corruption under the guise of renewable energy by giving out government tenders and government contracts to companies that they know are inefficient, but because give them bribes or corruption and other reasons to why give the government benefits. And this is something that I want to avoid. My stance on this motion is clear. I do not think that the Malaysian government should establish state-owned renewable energy companies Rather, they should focus on fully privatizing the renewable energy industry to allow market forces and the private sector to bring up renewable energy and sustainable energy in the future via a fully meritocratic as well as most efficient way of doing so. I think this context needs to be clear, because understand that currently in Malaysia, the oil-based power plants still exist. Tenaga Nasional Berhad still exists. Petronas still exists, and according to my research, they are looking to expand upstream pipelining as well as open and drill about 25 new oil wells this year. Meaning to say that if we do invest in renewable energy, this is going to be something for the future. In the short run, oil and gas industry still continue to exist, power plants and power grids still exist, and can be continually improved and expanded on, which means that in this for the foreseeable future, electrification to people. So I think that when regards to investing in renewable energy, we have the time and the space to allow private entrepreneurs to invest and decide by trial and error, decide which are the best methods and best technology to invest in and invent. And this is something that I think is good. What do I propose in terms of a model? 3 things specifically. Number 1, government subsidies and tax breaks for companies who dabble in renewable energy that do currently exist in the status quo will be continued. I'm further okay with pumping more taxpayer money into tax breaks and subsidies for these companies, so that if they face barriers into entries into the industry, they can have a certain amount of subsidies to start up their businesses. We also say that governments can buy shares within these renewable energy companies. However, it cannot own a controlling stake in the company, i.e. the shares they buy must be less than 49%. Secondly, governments must never buy out renewable energy companies. If these companies are dying, governments are not allowed to bail out these companies. The same way that governments tried to bail out Proton, which was too big to fail. Government tried to bail out Mars because it was the national identity of Malaysia. Government will never be allowed to buy out renewable energy companies in this model. Thirdly, we will have strict regulation of green technology and renewable energy patents. So while patents still exist, we will enforce companies and individuals must show that they are using the patents. If not, they will no longer have rights to these patents. Meaning to say that rich oil companies can no longer buy up these patents and sit on them to prevent the development of the renewable energy industry. I think it's something that's particularly important. I think also that most renewable energy technologies such as solar panels are also readily available in this market, so that's not really a problem with regards to accessing this technology. One argument in the speech why I think the state-run companies, specifically Malaysian government-run companies, are one of the most inefficient and one of the worst ways we can use to develop an infant industry in this country. Case study, let's look at the Bakun Dam in Sarawak. A couple of years ago, when they proposed this dam was proposed in 3 iterations. The first 2 iterations failed, but still the Sarawak government wanted to go ahead with it, right? The projected cost was 6.25 billion to start with. Currently, the current expenses has ballooned astronomically, and now by 2030, it is projected that electrical cost for Sarawak will reach up to 105 billion ringgit. That is from 6.25 billion to 105 billion. It's a pretty big increase if you ask me. Why does these things happen? Because understand that the third company, or all the 3 companies that have taken up these tenders in the past, this tender was given to them by the Sarawak government under the Chief Minister of Tai Mahmud. Why is this important? Because this betrays the extent to which corruption and cronyism is rampant within the Malaysian government. Because even though these companies have been shown to fail in the past, even though this project has been shown to be inefficient and shown to be not the best way to go about developing hydroelectricity, companies still wanted to do it because Tai Mahmud wanted the administration to be seen as the projector of hydroelectricity in Malaysia. But, oh, wait a minute, let's not talk about Malaysia, let's talk about Kia and Hyundai, says the second speaker. The first thing I will say through this is that the different context. If you want to talk about the Korean economy, often there's a lot more transparency and accountability within those governments, which means that corruption and cronyism are far more easily weeded out within those cases. In evidence to this, the previous president was outed on corruption charges. We don't tend to see those sort of things happening within Malaysia. Meaning to say, so the conclusion I want to make here is that when we talk about the context of Malaysia, I think it's far more likely that companies owned by the Malaysian government will be inefficient, will be subject to corruption and cronyism, and that's not something that we want to have for the new economy. The flip side to this argument is why private sectors are more efficient. In 1988, Tun Mahathir Mohamad privatized Tenaga Nasional Berhad, the current company that is in charge of handling one of the 2 energy companies within Peninsular Malaysia today. As of now, as of 2017, they made a profit of 2.2508 million ringgit in terms of profit, while only receiving 70 million ringgit worth of government grants. This shows that a privatized company within Malaysia, one that's not owned and dictated and directed by the government, can be run profitably within Malaysia today. More importantly, I think it goes to show that the Malaysian government should outsource and should privatize the energy industry because it can be more efficient. But even if it's not efficient, the government does not spend taxpayer money bailing out this company. The government does not spend time trying to salvage a sinking ship and try to make the image look good and things like that. Oh, but wait a minute. The energy sector is a natural monopoly. There's only one supplier. The assumption here is that there can only be one supplier. The fact in Malaysia that because that is Petronas as well as TNB just showed that isn't true to start with. More importantly, I think it goes back to the context of what we're debating in which we're talking about renewable energy. So currently, oil and gas industries and oil and gas-based power plants still exist and still will continue to grow. With regards to that, it's not really applicable to the debate about renewable energy. But the last response I will say to this is that if your problem is that natural monopolies are something that's bad, states can still regulate the extent to which these monopolies are like doing business. Make sure that they don't engage in practices that are inefficient. Make sure that they do not engage in things such as corruption. We think that public financial auditing are options that can ensure that these companies are efficient and are not cronyism. To be more effective, private companies are able to do cost-benefit calculations better because they are more result-oriented, they are profit-oriented. The point where they're inefficient, the point where they lose profits, and this is something that's a huge hit towards them. Private companies are far more efficient, far more result-oriented, and far more effective at bringing renewable energy to Malaysia.
Thank you, TJ, for the passionate speech. With that, the floor is open for POIs. Are there any POIs on the floor? Yit Wey followed by Framjee.
So my question is that you mentioned that it's better for private and government can invest in it, but just not to control it to avoid corruption as corruptions might occur. So my question is that the government you refer to is actually the previous government, and you say it's knocked out by corruption. And the new government now is like they are emphasizing transparency the most. Shouldn't it be the best time that the government actually invests in it as it also lessen the burden of private industry?
Thank you, Framjee.
You said that these firms are going to be altruistic in their profit-driven motives, but don't you believe that this very same profit-driven motive will translate to them exploiting consumers in the market, whereas the government doesn't have that sort of motive, whilst they may be arguably efficient?
Thank you, Framjee.
A new government in Malaysia brings hope to the Malaysian people, perhaps in the next 10 to 20 years. In the short run, I think that corruption in Malaysia is rooted within the endemic systems and the lack of transparency and accountability within the ministries and administrative systems, both on the federal level and the state levels within Malaysia. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission have just had fetters on it in release. The amount of time it will take to dredge out and track down all those politicians who have been corrupt in the past will take at least 10 to 20 years. And that's assuming that the current government will pump money into tracking down these people and not into what I argue is more important to developing the economy. So even if I accept the premise that the new government is more focused on accountability, I think at best it will take a lot of time for these things, for the sort of mechanism of accountability to occur to the rate where a state-run enterprise will be one that is effective. But secondly, I don't think any of these arguments undermines the analysis of why private companies who are profit-motivated can be more effective and can show better results for the same amount of money pumped into this industry. So to that extent, I still think Malaysian government should not own a company. To the second question of why profit-based companies can sometimes be profit-driven to the point of exploiting consumers. I think the first thing to say is that they most likely won't do this with regards to them, with regards to renewable energy. People kind of need the energy, which means that if you exploit them, they probably won't buy it from you. But even if that were the case, I still think that things such as government regulation are still an option. So if it can be shown that the cost for transporting energy from, let's say, urban KL to outside of Subang Jaya is one that is expensive, and the companies want to charge X really high price for it, either one, the state can cap the prices if they know that the company is exploiting consumers, or number two, if it's true that the cost of transporting energy is so high, states can pump subsidies and give aid for this company in order to allow the energy to transfer from wherever it's produced to where it's needed at a cost that is suitable for consumers. So I don't think this is an issue, or even if it is an issue, it does not outweigh the benefit of a privately run energy corporation.
Alright, thank you. So we still have a minute left with that, Chit.
Right. Bear in mind that actually our power nationally grid, we cannot just sell to anyone. It's not a free market where you want to buy from me or you want to buy from them. We buy everything from power nationally grid, from TMB, regulars, everything. Now, doesn't it, if we have private companies actually comes into where we need to give them government tenders and everything, this is where the corruption and communism actually comes into play. What you're proposing is actually promoting because it's not state-owned and it doesn't work in the interest of the people. Can you justify on that last part? It does not really work in terms of because state-owned company is being owned by the government itself, which is by the people itself. Get it? Sorry?
Would you like to rephrase it, Stephen? Okay, please rephrase it in just 2 sentences as a question.
Having private suppliers of companies to actually provide any that actually promotes cronyism and also corruption because those are being their profit are being driven by government tenders.
I think this question betrays lack of understanding of how private corporations and how the government functions. Meaning to say that government corporations are owned and directed by the government. So that the board of directors for Khazanah National are one that's directly appointed by the government. People who are running the company are appointed and the government has a direct say in how this company runs their business. This means that when it comes to making decisions, the decisions are not made based on cost-benefit analysis. The decisions are often influenced by political agendas and the personal interests of the politicians up there. Comparative to private corporations, private companies and the CEOs are like duty bound to their shareholders. At the end of the year, the financial report shows there is a loss the shares are going to put out. I think this is a far greater incentive to be results oriented. Or at least if the end goal is to provide energy to the people, we are far more likely to get this at when these companies and when the CEO of the companies are driven by profit rather than driven by the political agendas that are hidden within the current political system of Malaysia.
All right, thank you, Chen. So with that, we're moving on to our last speaker for session 2, Yit Wey.
So good morning, everyone. So let's focus on what this topic is actually arguing about. I think the second speaker has already mentioned, it's actually arguing about whether renewable energy provided by government or private. But let's think ahead. What determines who produce? What determines that someone, what motivates someone to actually produce particular goods or services? For a country base, it's definitely comparative advantage. At Malaysia, we are still a development country and we have a huge oil and gas industry. That is why our focus is more on growing oil and gas and also manufacturing. Our aim is to achieve as high growth as possible. And that is why for sustainability or renewable energy part, the focus is definitely lesser. Which means that there are less private entities out there who are actually trying to do that. And the second reason of them not motivated to do that is because the huge initial capital. To build a power source or anything related to renewable energy, that needs a huge machinery or even factory. How do they actually get that much of funding? And that is why my stance today is that government should actually establish state-owned renewable energy company. Government have more financial sources compared to private entities. That is why they can actually start a company, initial huge layout costs, huge research and development. The main purpose is to start up the whole infant industry of this renewable energy industry. When government started, it also means that it also shows to the public that government is actually realizing that we actually have to change our direction a bit. It's not true growth and we have to move towards sustainability as well. The most important part for this question, I think, is to create awareness. When government is doing that, we can actually create awareness. Everyone will know that what is government doing. But for private entity, it's not sure, they don't have that public awareness, public image to all others publics. So I give an example. Synergy C Senjian Berhad. Who have heard of it? Is anyone there heard of Synergy C Senjian Berhad? Yeah, it's actually a joint venture by Khazanah and another renewable energy company known as Cameo Chan Energy PLC from UK. Cardana, everyone heard of it, right? It's because it is public. And that, the previous company I mentioned, it's private. And that is the point I mentioned about, is to create the public awareness of the renewable energy. So as I mentioned, government has more points, more money. They can create more awareness. They have the more money to pump into research development and to start up an infant industry. But as mentioned also, this might lead to the risk of too big to fail, where there's monopolized of the whole industry. But for me, I don't think that will be the case. I'm not sure if anyone here is old enough. I think if 30 years ago, when Proton started, I'm sure that most of the people will actually support it. It's because it's the infant industry. People will support the government actually pumps into it. Even if there's no national card now, Proton is starting now, I will support it. That is the reason for it. And I believe the government should initiate the first move and not the private entities which does not have any incentive. So next, let's look at the current trend of our world. 2015, we have actually signed, United Nations actually signed, 144 countries of the United Nations actually signed the agreement to lower the climate change to less than 2% of the 2 degrees Celsius, I'm sorry. And next, moving back to local, TNB just a few days ago, they actually sell their gas-fired power plant in Pakistan. And they're actually moving towards, what they're trying to do is that they are trying to invest in, they're reducing reliance on fossil fuels, they are trying to invest in more renewable energy. This also shows that government is actually, they are trying to create the awareness, they're trying to take the first step towards it. The first step is actually important, as I believe that the most important part of this is actually not monopoly or government. Both sides can actually do it. A government can do it with more funds. The only problem is that they say that it might be too big to fail. But as I mentioned above before, infant industry needs the huge initial outlay of government. And that is why I believe at this stage, the public awareness point is more important, is outweigh the monopoly's point. That is why I believe that government should actually establish a state-owned renewable energy. So there's one more point I want to mention. The Energy, Science, Technology, Environment and Climate Change Minister, YB Yobin, actually states that we are actually, their aim is to improve to 20% renewable energy by 2030. When a minister actually says that, it creates more awareness. We can actually hear about it instead of just a private entity talking to their partners, talking to their shareholders that we are trying to improve this. So my point of view is that the main purpose for government to actually start it is to create the public awareness, is to tell everyone that we are actually doing it and we are moving towards this direction. For the transparency problem, as long as government maintains that their stance about the transparency, as I mentioned before, they are stressed to actually be transparent and be accountability, as long as they make sure that their part, like for example, 5 years they are going to do that, after that they will be reduced to just monitoring role. I believe that as long as they do that, government is the best way to do that, and it will attract private industry to actually goes into the industry as the industry are more familiarized. So I keep emphasizing on the awareness part, and next I'll spend the time for the action part. For private industry, as I mentioned, even if you are trying to do that, we can't do much. There's no really any money to actually do that. But for government, we can actually do for both awareness and action, which private entities lack in both. Thank you.
So with that, the floor is open for points of creation. Are there any? DJ followed by Framjee.
So it's nice to say that the government will be transparent, the government will be accountable. What will you do to ensure that these companies are transparent and accountable, and to ensure that officers within these companies that accept bribes or are punished?
Thank you, DJ.
Much like you stated in the beginning of your speech, Malaysia is still a developing country and therefore it's trying to grow and better itself. That's why most of the emphasis is on non-renewable sources of energy. Do you believe that Malaysia should follow in China's footsteps, another developing country, but to really deeply into the aspect of sustainable energy, not just with regards to energy production, but also motor vehicles.
Thank you, Framjee.
So for the transparent part, as I mentioned, they have to list out a plan like I mentioned just now. That, for example, 5 years plan. After 5 years, we are just reducing to a monitoring and just monitoring role instead of initiating role. I think that is important because it shows that the commitment of the government. Of course, internal part, I don't think that I can comment much of it. But as the external part, they should actually show public that we are actually trying to our main goal is just to start it. We just start it, and after it's established, we will leave it for you to do it. That is my point of view. That maybe 5 years later they will just reduce the monitoring role. And for the second question, it's regarding for the Malaysia and China comparison whether developing countries should invest in sustainability. As I mentioned before, because our comparative advantage is not at this area, it's at manufacturing and to focus more on growth. And that is why for private entities, our focus is to maximize profit, and we won't go into the other part which is huge capital cost. So that is why government should actually start that. And who knows, 5-10 years later, this might be our comparative advantage instead of oil and gas. And that is why that is my belief that government should actually initiate it and reduce their role in the future.
Thank you. We still have more time for PYs with electricity.
Do you think in the long run, nuclear power plant, which is considered renewable energy companies, do you think that how can Malaysia government actually build out or revert into a 5 year after 5 years initiating? Doesn't it needs in the long run you need to improve and develop more? What's your say on it?
So is the viewer clear?
Can you repeat it again?
There's a lot of renewable energies, for example, nuclear power plant. Doesn't you think that Malaysia should actually act in a role that not just initiating but also monitoring and also developing it in the long run, not just in 5 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. So currently, Synergy Senja Berhad, as I mentioned before, they actually has a few power plant. They actually have a few biogas power plant in Malaysia. And bear in mind that it's joint venture between Khazanah and another company from UK. So which means that as the times grows, the private entity can actually, as shown in this case, the private entity is actually contributing to it as well. So maybe 5 years time, as you said, it might be too short. So maybe 5 years time, it might be joint venture. In 10 years time, it might be fully private. So I'm not sure the time limit. I'm not really sure how much time do we actually need to build it. But my point of view is that government starts it. Maybe in the medium term, they can just like for this case, joint venture. In the future, they can drop out and just for monitoring and controlling role. Thank you.
We still have 50 seconds left, so if there are any other PYs or follow-ups, this is your last chance. TJ.
Could you explain more? What is the role, what is the monetary role that the government plays in the company that you referred to a number of times in your speech?
I believe that for this question, government can actually, in their budget plan, they can actually plan more budget to invest in this renewable energy source. And that is why I believe that if they are more flexibility to control their budget instead of private entities to find investor from everywhere. So they are easier to finance money from their source.
Okay, thank you. With that, we end the second session for semifinals.
Okay, so all audience.